beyond God. Late in his life, a Dominican master preaching in Cologne said something that would eventually be condemned by the Pope. He said, "I asked God to rid me of God." He wasn't rejecting faith. He wasn't losing his religion. He was a preacher of 30 years, a former master of the University of Paris, twice, and one of the most learned theologians in medieval Christianity. What he was doing was pointing beyond the God of ordinary prayer and petition towards something he called the Godhead. A desert, he called it. A desert beyond all names, beyond all forms, beyond even the Trinity. His name was Meister Eckhart. Whatever you've heard about Christian mysticism, tonight's conversation goes deeper than most people know. And it ends up somewhere you may not expect, standing next to the Buddha. Because what do you do when language runs out? Both Meister Eckhart and the Buddha found themselves at the same edge, where every positive statement about the ultimate turns out to be a limitation of what cannot be limited. God is love. Nibbana is peace. Every word a wall. Every wall a diminishment. Tonight, what they both found when the positive words ran out. Why the parallel matters, and why the divergence matters just as much. Two traditions, 17 centuries apart. Two methods. Two sets of negative words for what they both found when speech collapsed. You'll hear both answers, and you'll leave with a better question than either tradition gives you alone. Chapter 1. Start with the problem that both traditions eventually run into. Language is finite. The ultimate, whatever we mean by that word, is not. Every positive description limits. Say, God is love, and you have already reduced God to something less than God, because love, as we know it, is one attribute among many, and the ultimate cannot be one attribute among many. Say, Nibbana is peace, and you have already made Nibbana into a state that stands in contrast to non-peace, which means you have placed it inside the very framework of opposites it is supposed to be beyond. Every positive word draws a line. The ultimate is what the line cannot enclose. This problem is old, and there is a method for handling it, which runs through several centuries of religious thought in the West. The method is called apophatic, from the Greek apophasis, meaning denial or unsaying. Instead of describing the ultimate by what it is, you approach it by what it is not. Not this, not that, not any of the words we know. The apophatic tradition in Christianity has a specific lineage. It begins around the year 500, with an anonymous author writing under the name Dionysius the Areopagite, the man Paul converted in Athens, according to the Book of Acts. Scholars now call him Pseudo-Dionysius, because he was almost certainly not that first-century convert, but a Syrian monk writing 5 centuries later. His works, the divine names, the mystical theology, argue that God is beyond every name we can give, beyond even the name being itself. God is what the highest words point at, without any of the highest words ever reaching. From Pseudo-Dionysius, the tradition moves through John Scotus Eriugena in the 9th century, then through anonymous English contemplatives who wrote The Cloud of Unknowing in the 14th century. And in the same 14th century, at the height of this tradition, comes the preacher whose work will take the apophatic method to its most radical conclusion in medieval Christianity. His name was Eckhart von Hochheim. History remembers him as Meister Eckhart, Master Eckhart, a title that was not casual honorific, but formal academic rank. He was born around 1260 in Thuringia, in central Germany. He entered the Dominican order as a young man. The Dominicans were the intellectual order of the 13th and 14th centuries, the order of Albertus Magnus of Thomas Aquinas, dedicated to preaching and to the rigorous study of theology. Eckhart rose through their ranks. He held the Master of Theology chair at the University of Paris twice. That title, Magister, was rare. Aquinas held it once. Eckhart held it twice. In sheer academic distinction, he was among a handful of theologians in his century, but he was not only a scholar, he was also a preacher. And here is where the story becomes interesting. Eckhart preached to two very different audiences. In Latin, to the theologians and the clergy, he produced formal academic works. In German, to lay audiences, and particularly to communities of religious women called the Beguines. He preached sermons that pushed further than perhaps any Christian preacher had pushed before. The Beguines matter for this story. They were lay women who lived in intentional communities in the towns of the Rhineland and the Low Countries. They had not taken formal vows. They lived in a strange space between the ordinary world and the monastery. Many of them were deeply serious about the interior life. They asked hard questions, and they had access to Eckhart, the Master of Paris, as their preacher. To these women, in their vernacular German, Eckhart delivered the sermons that would eventually get him condemned. One of them was Sermon 52, on the Beatitude, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." This is the sermon that contains the line that survives him most vividly. I ask God to rid me of God. Now, hearing that line cold, it sounds like a rejection of religion. It is not. Eckhart is describing what he calls the third and highest poverty of spirit. And to understand the line, you have to hold his frame. He identifies three poverties. The first is poverty of will. Most people, when they aspire to holiness, aspire to want what God wants. Their will has been surrendered. They no longer want their own way. They want only God's way. This is a serious achievement. Most religious lives never get past it. But Eckhart says it is not the deepest poverty. A will surrendered to God's will is still a will. It still has content. The deeper poverty is to have no will at all, not even the will to do God's will, because the deepest surrender is not to want anything, including holiness. The second poverty is poverty of knowledge. Even after the will is emptied, the mind still has content. It still knows God, or thinks it does. It carries a picture of God around inside itself. Eckhart says this too must go. That the deepest poverty is not to have God as an object of knowledge in the mind, because as long as God is an object in your mind, God is inside your mind, and the infinite cannot be inside anything. The third poverty is poverty of possession, and this is the most radical. Even after the will is emptied and the mind is emptied, there remains a subtle possession, the sense that God dwells in me, that I have God, that God is present in the depths of my soul. Eckhart says even this must go, not because God is not present in the soul, but because the moment you frame it as God in me, you have made God into something you possess, and the infinite cannot be possessed. And so the prayer, I ask God, the personal God of prayer, the God of relationship, to rid me of God. Because at the deepest level, at the level of what Eckhart calls the Godhead, there is no distinction between the one praying and the one prayed to. God and I are one in this operation. Not one because two things have been fused. One because the distinction was never fundamental in the first place. This is the apophatic move pushed to its summit, and it requires the distinction that is Eckhart's most important contribution. The distinction between Gott and Gottheit, between God and Godhead. Gott, God, is the personal God of ordinary Christian faith, the God who creates, the God who reveals himself, the God who responds to prayer, the God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is the God of religion, the God of the sacraments, The God every Christian in Cologne would have recognized, Gottheit, Godhead, is something else, not a second God, not a rival to the Trinity, but the ground of God himself, the depth from which the Trinity emerges, the primordial reality before all differentiation, before the Father, before the Son, before the Spirit. Eckhart calls it a desert, die Wüste der Gottheit, the desert of the Godhead. In the desert of the Godhead, he says, no distinction has ever appeared of Father, Son, or Holy Spirit, and in one of his sermons he puts it as bluntly as it can be put. God and Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. That is a startling sentence for a Dominican master to say. It suggests that behind the personal God of Christian worship, the God to whom one prays, the God who saves, the God who judges, there is a further depth, a depth beyond attributes, a depth beyond even the Trinity itself, a depth that cannot be prayed to because it cannot be addressed. To pray, you need a subject and an object. In the desert of the Godhead, no subject and no object have yet appeared. When Eckhart says, I ask God to rid me of God, he means, I ask the personal God to release me into the Godhead. I ask God to release me into Gottheit, release me from the very framework of subject and object, of one who prays and one who is prayed to, into that desert where no such distinction has ever appeared. This is not heresy in intention, but it was heard as heresy, and in 1326, the Archbishop of Cologne opened an inquisition against Eckhart's teaching. Eckhart defended himself. He wrote a formal response. He insisted on the orthodoxy of his intent, and when the Cologne Inquisition proceeded against him anyway, he did something few accused heretics did. He appealed directly to the Pope. He set out for Avignon, where the papal court then resided, to defend his teaching in person before Pope John XXIII. He made it to Avignon. He presented his defense. And there, sometime in the first months of 1328, before the papal verdict was issued, Meister Eckhart died. He was probably 68 years old. The verdict came the following year. On March 27, 1329, Pope John XXIII issued the bull in Agro Dominico, in the Lord's field. 28 propositions from Eckhart's work were condemned. 17 were declared heretical outright. 11 more were declared suspect. Eckhart himself, by then more than a year dead, never heard the sentence read. 2 of the condemned propositions are especially relevant tonight. The first, something in the soul is uncreated and uncreatable. If the whole soul were such, it would be uncreated and uncreatable, and this is the intellect. The second, all creatures are pure nothing. I do not say they are small or they are something, but they are pure nothing. Hold both of those. They will matter later. What the Church condemned in Eckhart is exactly the territory where his thought comes closest to something the Buddhist tradition would also have found problematic, but for opposite reasons. Now, some listeners will know that in 1957, the Japanese Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki published a book called Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist, in which he argued that Meister Eckhart was, in essence, saying what Zen Buddhism says, that Eckhart and the Buddhist tradition had arrived at the same experience by different routes. Suzuki was the first to make this comparison widely available in English, and it caught fire in the mid-20th century. Scholars since then have been more cautious. Bernard McGinn, the great American historian of Christian mysticism, who has given decades of his career to Eckhart, describes what Suzuki was pointing at as a family resemblance. Wittgenstein's term, similar features, shared inheritance of ancient philosophy, some Neoplatonic, some transmitted through Islamic thought, but not the same species, not the same tradition, not, McGinn argues, the same underlying reality, not the same species, McGinn writes, but clearly from the same part of the philosophical forest. That is the honest scholarly frame for what tonight is about. Not identity, not equivalence, but genuine family resemblance, real enough that it deserves serious attention, different enough that it deserves careful attention. The parallel is there. The parallel is not the whole story. So what did the Buddha find at his own edge when his own language ran out? That is where we go next. Chapter 2. The Buddha faced the same problem as Eckhart, 17 centuries earlier. He faced it in a different framework, in a different language, under a different sky. He was not defending a doctrine of God. He was describing a path of liberation. But the problem was structurally the same. What he was pointing at, what the entire path was aimed at, could not be described in positive terms without being falsified. His answer, like Eckhart's, was apophatic, negative language, what it is not. The clearest statement of this is preserved in a small text called the Udana, the sayings of the Buddha, as Sutta, Ud 8.3. The Buddha is speaking to the monks, and he says, "There is, monks, an unborn, an unbecome, an unmade, an unconditioned. If there were not this unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, no escape from the born, the become, the made, the conditioned would be possible. But because there is this unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned, an escape from the born, the become, the made, the conditioned is possible." Listen to how that is constructed. 4 negatives, one after another: unborn, unbecome, unmade, unconditioned. He does not say what nibbana is. He says what it is not. It is not born in the way things are born. It is not becoming in the way things become. It is not made in the way things are made. It is not conditioned in the way things are conditioned. Everything the Buddha's audience would have understood as ordinary reality, birth, becoming, making, conditioning, is denied of the ultimate. This is the apophatic method in its purest Buddhist form, and it is not accidental. It runs throughout the earlier strata of the Pali Canon. There is a whole section of the Samyutta Nikaya, a collection called the Asankata Samyutta, the connected discourses on the unconditioned, at SN 43, where the Buddha and his monks list epithet after epithet for Nibbana. Each epithet a negation, each epithet pointing to what Nibbana is not: the unafflicted, the undefiled, the unmade, the uncreated, the unaging, the undying, the unfabricated, on and on. Many epithets, each of them a way of saying, not this, not that, not any of the words we know. Why so many negations? Because a single negation is not enough. If you say the unborn, a hearer might imagine a state of not yet born, which is still a state, still conditioned by its relation to birth. If you say the undying, a hearer might imagine an eternal life, which is just a continuation of ordinary life without its end. Every single negation gets absorbed back into the framework of positive language if it stands alone. Only by piling them up, by refusing every framework, does the pointing hold. This is exactly what Eckhart is doing in the Christian tradition, piling up the negations, refusing every framework, saying, not this either, not that either, beyond names, beyond forms, beyond being itself. Structurally, the two moves are the same move. Now, the Buddha goes further than most religious teachers of his era in one specific way. He does not only refuse positive descriptions of the ultimate, he refuses even to answer certain questions about it. In the Majjhima Nikaya, there is a famous encounter, Sutta MN 72, where a wanderer named Vacchagotta asks the Buddha a series of questions. Does an awakened being exist after death? Does an awakened being not exist after death? Does he both exist and not exist? Does he neither exist nor not exist? The four positions of Indian logic. Vacchagotta wants an answer to one of them. The Buddha refuses to answer any of them. He says the question does not apply, and then he gives his famous simile. Suppose a fire is burning, and then suppose the fire goes out. Where has the fire gone? North, south, east, west? The question does not apply. The fire has not gone anywhere. The conditions that sustained it have ceased, and there is nothing more to say about it. It has not gone somewhere else. It has simply stopped being fire. The same, the Buddha says, is true of the awakened being at death. The question, does he exist? And the question, does he not exist? Both assume a framework that does not fit. To say he exists is to say too much. To say he does not exist is to say too much. The apophatic move, refuse the frameworks. Do not fill in what cannot be filled in. This is not agnosticism. The Buddha is not saying, I do not know whether the awakened being exists after death. He is saying, your question, phrased this way, cannot be answered because the framework it assumes does not apply to what you are asking about. It is a methodological silence, not an ignorant silence. There is another discourse, Sutta, SN 12.15, the Kakayanagotta Sutta, where the Buddha says something even more startling. He says that the world runs on two views. Everything exists and nothing exists. Both, he says, are extremes. The awakened one holds neither. He teaches by the middle, which in this context does not mean a compromise between existence and non-existence, but a refusal of both frameworks. Existence and non-existence are conceptual categories that the awakened understanding has moved beyond. Beyond it exists, beyond it does not exist. Neither category applies. Hold that next to Eckhart. God and Godhead are as different as heaven and earth. The Gott whom we can address, who exists in the sense that we can pray to him, who acts in the sense that we can speak of his acts, is not the ultimate. The ultimate is the Gottheit, the desert of the Godhead, beyond every attribute, beyond every distinction, beyond the ordinary categories of existence and non-existence that structure our language. Two traditions, 17 centuries apart, both refusing the same categories, both saying, your ordinary language cannot reach where I am pointing. The parallel is real, and it is worth pausing on how strange it is that two traditions with almost no historical contact, Eckhart never heard of the Buddha, and the Buddha lived 4 centuries before Christianity existed, arrived at the same methodological move. Both piled up negations, both refused positive attributes, both used the framework of not this, not that, to point at what their positive religious languages could not enclose. But, and here we come to a question that has been debated seriously in the 20th and 21st centuries. Does the fact that the method is the same imply that what the method points at is the same? This is not a trivial question, and it is not settled. In the middle of the 20th century, a scholarly tradition emerged which said yes. The most famous representative is Aldous Huxley, whose 1945 book, The Perennial Philosophy, argued that at the mystical core of every major religious tradition, there is the same experience, the same underlying reality, the same encounter with what Huxley called the divine ground. Different cultures dress it in different theological clothes, but the encounter is the same. Meister Eckhart and the Buddha, on this view, are seeing the same thing and calling it by different names. Houston Smith, the 20th century historian of religions, held a similar position. So did D.T. Suzuki, whom we already met. When he compared Eckhart to Zen, he was assuming a perennialist frame. What all the great mystics saw was at bottom, one reality. This position is called perennialism, and for several decades after the Second World War, it was close to the default view in the popular study of comparative mysticism. Then, in 1978, a philosopher named Stephen Katz published a paper called Language, Epistemology, and Mysticism, and the field changed. Katz's argument was simple. There are, he said, no pure experiences. Every experience, including every mystical experience, is shaped by the conceptual framework of the person having it. A Christian mystic has been trained for years in Christian theology, Christian scripture, Christian liturgical practice, Christian expectations about what an encounter with God would be. A Buddhist meditator has been trained in the Buddha's teaching, in the Vipassana method, in the framework of anatta and anicca and dependent origination. When each of them reaches the depths of their practice, they do not arrive at some pure, unmediated experience. They arrive at an experience shaped by everything they have been trained to expect. So Eckhart, at the summit of Christian apophatic contemplation, does not encounter the same thing that the Buddhist meditator encounters at the summit of Vipassana. He encounters what a lifetime of Christian formation has prepared him to encounter, described in the language his tradition has given him. The Buddhist meditator encounters what a lifetime of Buddhist formation has prepared her to encounter, described in the language her tradition has given her. The languages sound similar because both are apophatic, but the experiences behind the languages are shaped by very different training. This is called constructivism, and it has been the dominant view in the academic study of comparative mysticism for the last 40+ years. Both positions have serious scholars behind them. Perennialism is not naive. Constructivism is not merely deflationary. And the debate between them is not settled. What tonight's conversation can offer is not an adjudication of that debate. What it can offer is honesty about where we are. The parallel between Eckhart and the Buddha is real. Both use the apophatic method. Both refuse positive attributes for the ultimate. Both arrive at silence rather than at a positive description. That much is clear, whether they are pointing at the same reality, whether the desert of the Godhead and the unconditioned are, in the end, one territory called by two names, is a question the honest scholar leaves open. Bernard McGinn's family resemblance is probably the best formulation available. Not identity, not equivalence, but a genuine kinship at the level of method, with real divergence at the level of framework, which brings us to the divergence itself. Because the parallel is one story, the divergence is another, and the divergence is more specific, more locatable than most people realize. There is one exact point where the two traditions do not just diverge, but actively contradict each other. And it is not where you might expect. That is where we go next. Chapter 3. Start with where they meet. Both traditions arrive at the apophatic method. The piling up of negations, the refusal of positive attributes, the trust that silence points more truly than speech. Both refuse to reduce the ultimate to an object of ordinary knowledge. Both refuse to make it an attribute among attributes. And both structure their contemplative path around a progressive release. Recall Eckhart's 3 poverties. Poverty of will, releasing every craving, including the craving to want what God wants. Poverty of knowledge, releasing every mental picture of God, every category by which the mind holds God as an object. Poverty of possession, releasing even the sense that God dwells in me, that I have God as a treasure at the center of my soul. Now hold that next to the Buddhist path. The Buddhist tradition also names 3 things that must be released. 3 at the heart of the second noble truth and the meditative path. The first is tanha, craving. The second is sanya, the categorical grip by which perception carves the world into things I want and things I do not, into me and not me. The third is upadana, clinging, the subtle grasping by which even after craving is calmed and perception is loosened, the mind still holds on to what it takes to be its own. Notice the structure. Eckhart releases will, knowledge, possession. The Buddhist path releases craving, categorical perception, clinging, not identical, but structurally kin. Both traditions are describing a progressive letting go. First of what we want, then of how we know, then of what we hold as ours. This is a structural resemblance, not a doctrinal equivalence. Say that clearly. The two traditions are approaching the same edge, the collapse of the ordinary subject-object relationship, from very different theological starting points. But the shape of the approach is genuinely similar. Both traditions see that release must go all the way down. Both traditions see that the last thing to be released is the most subtle. The sense of having, the sense of ownership, the sense of God dwells in me, or this is mine. That is the meeting. It is real. It is worth honoring. Now for the parting. There is one exact point where the two traditions do not just diverge, but actively contradict each other. And here it is. Eckhart taught, in one of the propositions the Church would condemn, that there is, at the very center of the human soul, something uncreated and uncreatable. He called it by several names in his sermons: the little spark of the soul, Seelenfunklein; the little castle, the ground of the soul, Seelengrund; the uncreated intellect. Different names, one idea. At the deepest depth of the human person, Eckhart taught, there is a point that is not created, not made, not conditioned, a point identical in its ground with the Godhead's own ground. Liberation, for Eckhart, is the return of this uncreated spark to the uncreated Godhead, from which it was never really separate. Two grounds meeting, or rather, two grounds recognized as one ground. This is the proposition the Church condemned in 1329. Something in the soul is uncreated and uncreatable. If the whole soul were such, it would be uncreated and uncreatable. And this is the intellect. Rome heard in this a claim that part of the human soul is as divine as God, that the human being possesses at its own center a piece of the uncreated. This was a heresy in the Church's frame. Only God is uncreated. Everything else, including every soul, is created. To say part of the soul is uncreated is to say part of the human being is God, and no orthodox theology could allow that. That was Rome's problem with Eckhart. The Buddhist problem with Eckhart would be different. Not opposite, different. From a Buddhist perspective, the Seelenfunklein, the uncreated spark, the ground of the soul, is precisely what does not exist. Not because the human person is nothing, not because the human person is annihilated in liberation, but because there is no uncreated, permanent ground at the center of the person. There never was. What we take to be the deepest self, the ground of the soul, the uncreated point at the center, this, in Buddhist analysis, is exactly what the Buddha called Sakkaya Ditthi, the view of self, a subtle and very convincing illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. The five aggregates, form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, are all conditioned, all impermanent, all without a permanent ground beneath them. This is the teaching the Buddha gave in the very first discourse after his awakening. It is repeated in the Anattalakkhana Sutta, SN 2259, where he tells the first 5 monks, one aggregate at a time. Form is not self. Feeling is not self. Perception is not self. Mental formations are not self. Consciousness is not self, each in turn. None of them a resting place. None of them an uncreated ground. So the Church condemned Eckhart for saying too much, for saying that part of the soul is as divine as God. The Buddhist tradition would question Eckhart for a different reason, for positing an uncreated ground in the soul at all. To Rome, Eckhart's Seelenfunklein claimed too much divinity. To Buddhist analysis, it claims too much substance, same doctrine. Two different critiques, from two different sides. That is the divergence. And it is more locatable than most people realize when they encounter the Eckhart-Buddha comparison for the first time. The desert of the Godhead, Eckhart's ultimate, is a ground. It is the ground from which the Trinity emerges. It is the depth to which the uncreated soul spark returns. The framework is still, in the last analysis, a framework of ground and what arises from ground. Even at its most apophatic, Eckhart's thought stays inside the shape of a metaphysics of foundation. There is a bottom, and the bottom is what he calls Godhead. Nibbana, in the earliest Buddhist teaching, is not a ground. It is the unconditioned. But unconditioned here does not mean the foundation from which the conditioned arises. It means the cessation of the conditions that sustain suffering, the extinguishing of the fire, not the ground beneath the fire, the end of the burning. This is why the Buddha's fire simile is so precise. The fire that has gone out has not gone somewhere. It has not returned to some deeper fire ground from which fire arises. The conditions have ceased, and there is nothing more to say. Two different silences at the end. Eckhart's silence is the silence of the Godhead before the Word. A generative silence, a fertile silence, the desert from which all creation eventually emerges. Even in Eckhart's most apophatic moments, the Godhead is not a nothing. It is a fullness so full it cannot be named, a ground so grounded it cannot be described. The Buddhist silence is the silence of what is beyond arising, not a generative silence, not a fertile silence, the cessation of generation itself, the end of the conditions that keep arising going, the fire out. Both silences are real. Both traditions arrive at them honestly, but they are not the same silence. And it is more respectful to both traditions to say so than to collapse them into a unity that neither tradition would recognize, which brings us to what each tradition can offer the other. Because this is not, and this is important, a video about who wins. What Eckhart's apophatic path offers Buddhist reflection, a reminder that the unconditioned is not nothing. Even Rome understood this. Rome condemned Eckhart for saying creatures are pure nothing, because nothing is itself a category, and applied to what has genuine being, it is a heresy. The Buddhist tradition sometimes gets heard in the West as saying that liberation is annihilation, that Nibbana is a nothing. Eckhart's tradition, at its most apophatic, still refuses that reduction. The desert of the Godhead is not nothing. It is what cannot be named because it is too full to be named. That is a reminder worth holding, even from across the theological gulf. What Buddhist anatta offers Eckhart's tradition? A very careful examination of any claim to an uncreated ground in the soul. The Seelenfunklein is a beautiful concept. It is also, from the Buddhist angle, a subtle form of the view of self, the last, most refined, most spiritually respectable version of the very grasping the whole path is supposed to release. Even the most sophisticated theology of the inner spark, Buddhist analysis would say, needs to be examined for what it is, another place the mind can rest, another ground the self can settle into, another version of this is mine, this is me, This is what I am. And the path does not end while any such place remains. Two traditions, two critiques, one man standing between them, condemned by Rome for saying too much, questioned by Buddhist analysis for saying it in the wrong direction. And this is where the AND begins to matter more than the but. Not, Eckhart is right, but the Buddhist tradition disagrees. Not, the Buddhist tradition is right, but Eckhart went further. And Eckhart's apophatic reach and the Buddhist critique of any permanent ground, both held together, are more interesting than either alone. The parallel is real, the divergence is real, and holding both is the honest response, which is where tonight's video finally arrives. Close return to 1329. Two propositions condemned. The first, something in the soul is uncreated and uncreatable, and this is the intellect. The second, all creatures are pure nothing. Rome heard in the first a claim that part of the human being is as divine as God. Rome heard in the second a claim that creation has no reality of its own. Both were declared heretical. If the Church of 1329 had somehow encountered Buddhist teaching, its condemnations would have run the other way. It would not have condemned an utter for saying the soul is divine. It would have condemned it for denying any permanent soul ground at all. It would not have condemned Buddhist teaching on emptiness for saying creation is nothing. It would have condemned it for teaching that all conditioned things are without self, that there is no permanent essence at the center of anything. Same territory, opposite critiques. A Dominican friar and a tradition from the other side of the world, both standing in a place where the Church's language could not follow, and both, from within that place, saying things the Church could not accept for opposite reasons. That is a strange thing to notice, and it is worth noticing carefully, because what it means is this: the apophatic edge is real. Both traditions found it. Neither could be reduced to ordinary religious language once they reached it. Both were misheard in different ways by frameworks that were not built to contain them. And yet, even at that edge, the two traditions did not arrive at exactly the same place. Eckhart found a desert that is a ground. The Buddha found a cessation that is not a ground. Eckhart's silence is the silence of the Godhead before the Word, full of generative possibility, the depth from which all creation eventually comes. The Buddha's silence is the silence of what has stopped arising, the end of the burning, the fire that has gone out. Both silences are honest, both silences are earned, but they are not the same silence, and it is more respectful to both traditions to say so. Now, hold this next to Eckhart's prayer. I ask God to rid me of God. Hold it next to the Buddhist path. Free yourself from even the notion that there is a self being freed. These are not the same instruction. Read carefully. They are pointing in slightly different directions. Eckhart is asking to be released from the framework of personal God, from Gott, into the depth of Gottheit, where the distinction between the one who prays and the one prayed to has never appeared. The Buddhist path is asking for something even more radical in one specific respect. Not release into a deeper ground, but release from the very assumption that there is a ground into which to be released. The self is not returning to a divine self. There was no self returning. The path ends when the assumption of a pathwalker dissolves. Different instructions. Kin, but not identical. Family resemblance, in Bernard McGinn's careful phrase. Not the same species, but clearly from the same part of the philosophical forest. Whether that forest is in the end one forest, whether the desert of the Godhead and the unconditioned are two names for one territory or two territories genuinely distinct. This is the question tonight's video leaves open. Not because we do not know, but because leaving it open is the honest response. The scholars who have given decades to this question do not agree. Perennialism has not settled the matter. Constructivism and a video that pretended to close it would be lying to you. What tonight can offer is smaller and, I hope, more useful. It can offer the parallel, real, structurally deep, not accidental. Two traditions independently arriving at the apophatic method. Two traditions independently arriving at silence rather than positive description. Two traditions independently structuring their contemplative paths around a progressive release. That is a real fact about religious experience. It is worth honoring. It can offer the divergence, locatable, specific, not decorative. The Seelenfunklein is exactly what Buddhist teaching says does not exist. The desert of the Godhead is aground in a way the unconditioned is not. Eckhart's silence is generative. The Buddha's silence is the cessation of generation. These are not the same. It is worth honoring that too, and it can offer the and, not Eckhart is right, but the Buddhist tradition disagrees, not the Buddhist tradition is right, but Eckhart went further, and both traditions holding each other in the same field of attention, each illuminating what the other cannot say alone. Meister Eckhart died in Avignon in the first weeks of 1328. He was probably 68. He had come to defend his teaching in person, and he did not live to hear the verdict. A year after his death, 28 of his propositions were condemned. His body was buried in Avignon. The exact location has been lost. His German sermons circulated quietly among the mystics for centuries. In the 20th century, they came back into wider view, partly because scholars rediscovered them, partly because Buddhist teachers like D.T. Suzuki saw in them something familiar, partly because Christian contemplatives, Thomas Merton, Bede Griffiths, and others, began to read them as testimony from the edge of their own tradition, testimony that pointed toward, or at least alongside, the great non-Christian contemplative traditions of the East. The Buddha died, probably in the 5th century before the Christian era, in a village called Kusinara, at what tradition remembers as the age of 80. His last recorded words to the monks around him were, "All conditioned things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. No claim about the Godhead. No claim about the ultimate." A final apophatic gesture in the form of a practical instruction. Release and keep going. 17 centuries apart. Different soil, different sky. Two teachers who both, at the end, would not tell you what the ultimate is. They would only tell you what it is not. And they would ask you, each in his own way, to release even the framework in which the question first arose, beyond God. That was where Eckhart pointed. And, in the sense of ordinary religious speech, that is also where the Buddha pointed. Not toward atheism, not toward denial, toward what neither God nor no God can enclose. Whether what lies beyond is one country or two, whether the desert of the Godhead and the unconditioned meet at last, or run parallel forever, or diverge at some point too deep for us to see, that question is left honestly at the edge where tonight's video stops. Both teachers, at their own edges, stop speaking too. Perhaps that is the deepest thing they have in common.